Hi, this is Cindy Pope. I'm here in the Cool Tools studio to teach you how to make custom bezels using the Silhouette Curio and FS999 clay. Here's an example of one of the bezels I'm going to show you how to do. I'm going to show you in the software how to design it and how to cut it and how to construct the bezel. I want to show you the back of this piece. This piece is designed using the Silhouette, and I've designed the back to mirror a lot of the shapes in the front. So let's get started. I'm going to start with the process of showing you all the tools we're going to use for making the bezel. We need a piece of cardstock. This needs to be nice thin cardstock, about 1 card thick. The curio and a curio blade. You need to have a little applicator. The Princeton brush, which is a lovely brush that they sell at Cool Tools. It's perfect for detail work. Tweezers, a ruler, a torch station with a mini torch. You need to have a prepared base. I'm going to show you how to do the bezel, but you need to prepare your base however you would like. And you need a stone. We need a little bit of water to quench our bezel. We need FS999 sheet. And these are made using the new 1.5 card Curio rolling frames, and you want to assess the height to make sure you've rolled it true to 1.5 cards. We also need art clay silver. It's what we use to join our bezels, and we're going to need a heating surface. So in order to do a bezel, we need 2 measurements. We need to measure the height of the bezel. You need to measure the circumference around the stone. But in order to measure the circumference around the stone, you don't want to use thin paper. You want to use something that's exactly as thick as the clay that you've rolled. So what I've done is I've taken masking tape and I've layered up this masking tape 4 layers, and it's almost exactly as high as this bezel. So I'm going to get a true measurement when I do the circumference. What I'm going to do, because it's tape, it's going to stick. Now it doesn't need to be that tight. If you do any metalworking, you know that there's always a little bit of give in the bezel. So I'm going to mark the point which it joins. I'm then going to cut it. And then I'm going to put it in my ruler so I have the true measurement. Because we're working with stones, I always measure in millimeters. And then I'm going to write down that number. It's about 77 millimeters. The other thing we need to measure is the table. You need to know how high your bezel needs to be. And I want to tell you, I err in designing on the side of being a little higher. When you're doing a custom bezel, you want the prongs to kind of almost show, so they go higher than they would go if you were doing a traditional bezel. And we're also going to do a test in paper to make sure it fits. So we've got about 5 millimeters, and that's the point where it starts to curve, and your bezel will need to be at a minimum that height. And now we're ready to go ahead and test on paper. Okay, now that we've finished measuring our pretty stone, we're going to use those measurements to actually design a bezel. Our circumference of our stone was 77 millimeters, and our table height is 5 millimeters. And those are the post-firing numbers, and we're never going to increase it for shrinkage till we're all done with the process. The table height is 5 millimeters, but actually that's at a minimum. We might want to go a little bit higher with the prongs sticking up. I'm thinking like 6.5. So I'm going to draw a line. And the line needs to be 77 millimeters long. But you don't have to draw it perfectly because there's a little spot up at the top in the control panel where you can just type in 77, it'll change it. It's much easier than dragging it to the right length. I'm going to duplicate it because I always like and put it up in the top. So I have my 100% right up there. And then I like to have a couple extra spires. If you get really, really good at this, you might not need to do that, but I feel like it's helpful to give yourself some wiggle room. In case you had measured incorrectly, if you break one end off, or if you want to cut an extra piece off and use it somewhere, I just think it's a good idea to have a couple extra prongs in your bezel. And actually, you could do a long one and use it for multiple bezels. And you're not limited because you can draw make the clay very, very long. Okay, so I've got about room for 2 extra spires. And now I'm going to go ahead and draw that little component. And I'm going to draw it using the polygon drawing tool. If I wanted it to be rounded, I would use the curved drawing tool, but I want it to be nice sharp points like on the original. And I just click on points and it draws. And it will draw until you hit escape or till you join it up to the top one. So I'm joining up to the top one. And there we go. Now I'm going to point at it. I'm going to double click. And you see little points come up. And there's where you can actually adjust this. So I'm not a good drawing person the first time, so I love vector graphics because they allow me to adjust what I've done instead of trying to draw it like 15 times and never getting it quite right. You can delete points. You can move points. You just click on them. You can actually also curve points, which I think is really pretty and would be very pretty with this bezel. I think I'll make another one like that. So if you choose make curve, all of a sudden, and corner, all of a sudden you can have a really pretty rounded shape. You could have it go in. It's really interesting what you can do. So I'm going to hit undo to go back to our original because I want to go with what we originally drew, but it's not symmetrical. And that makes me crazy. So I'm going to show you how I make many, many of my shapes symmetrical. And I'm going to do that by using the knife to slice through it. I put it right in the center of a line. I'm going to go over to the knife. I'm going to choose it. And then I'm going to make sure it says outline. I don't want a line drawn. I just want to break it. And straight. Once I've made sure those are there, I'm just going to slice straight down. And it won't cut until you release it. So now I have 2 halves. I'm just going to use one of those, and I'm going to mirror the shape. And we use replicate to mirror the shape, and that's this little button here. We're going to mirror it to the left, and then I'm going to draw a box around it and right-click, make compound path, or we can do object make compound path. Now it's one shape, but we need to double-click on it because we've got some little broken parts. And the cool thing this program does is if you touch on red points right next to each other, they automatically join. So now we have a nice closed shape. I'm going to delete the other one. And I also like to put a little circle in these. It would be a really pretty bezel without. It kind of depends on how big the stone is you're holding. And I'm not good at self-editing. I always like to add a little something extra. So you want to make sure that the circle isn't too close to the edges. This is a tiny prong. And Wannery used to always say, you maybe could cut thin 1 millimeter ones, but you really want to have more space. So I like to have 1.5 millimeters between the hole and the edge of this little prong. So once I've got the size correct, I'm going to draw a drag box around it. And I'm going to center it to the middle. If I centered it up and down, it might not be where I want it. But I do want it centered to the middle. So as soon as I touch it with a drag box, it selects it. And I'm going to do this one that says center to middle. And then I'm going to right click, make it a compound path. Okay, I've got my prong designed. I'm always going to duplicate it and put it off to the side. I like to save my components. I may want to use them again. I may want to use it with a different component next to it, but I always like to save them because if you love a bezel, you don't want to have to cut it apart to get that shape back. And now I'm going to shrink it down, and I'm going to squeeze it in a little bit. Now I messed with that oval, so I'm going to go up and make it a circle by just typing in the right measurements. And I like that measuring bit at the top. I think it's very helpful. And I'm going to draw a drag box around them. I'm going to center it again. And then I'm going to make it a compound path. So now my component's ready. I'm going to duplicate it and put it over to the edge. Now I'm going to shrink it down, and we're going to make a lot of them for a bezel. I want it about the same size as this one because I already did one, and I determined from measuring my stone that I wanted about 12 to 14 prongs. The first one I did, I had way too many prongs and it was way too tiny. And so that's why we're going to do a paper test so you'll actually get a really good look at what your bezel is going to look like. So you won't have to make that same mistake I made. So if any of you have done a text to path, this is a new thing in version 4, and it's called object to path. So we're going to go to the replicate window, and that's where it's located. And there's 3 little menus here where we're going to go to the third one. And in the third one, we're going to say show grab handles. And it's going to create a little blue button, and we're going to zoom in so you can see it. And that little blue button can drag it to the line just like you used to be able to drag text, only it'll duplicate it. And next to it, there's a little green button, and you can drag that to fill in that line. We don't want them too close together, but I'm going to fill in that line. And you can also adjust things over the right-hand side. So you could actually angle these, which would be an interesting bezel. You can also increase the number of size. You can increase the space between them. So we're going to kind of play around with that. And once we've got everything right, we're going to say release copies. Once you release copies, it's no longer attached to that line, and you can pull them down. And we've deleted the line because we don't need it anymore. And we're going to do a drag box around them all, and we're going to make them a compound path. That means they will always stay together. You can also go to Object, Make Compound Path. So there's a couple different ways to get to everything in the Silhouette software. So I'm going to take that original bezel length and I'm going to move it down, and we're going to use it in just a minute. But first we're going to finish making our bezel. So I'm going to go to the drawing tools, and I'm going to go to the square drawing tool. I'm going to draw a little rectangle because it has to look like a bezel on the bottom. And so I'm going to make it about the same distance on both ends. Remember, we have extra prongs, but I want that extra bit to be about halfway between each prong. It makes it a little bit easier to put it all together at the end. So I need to test this for the table height because remember, we wanted it to be about 6 or 6.5, and I think this is pretty good. So once I've determined it's the proper height, I'm going to make a duplicate because I'm going to show you 2 different ways to handle this and a potential problem. So I'm going to take that second one and pull it down. And when in doubt, always make duplicates. I think it's a really helpful design thing. It keeps you from having to go back. So I'm going to draw a drag box around both of them and select them, and I'm going to do weld. And weld makes your bezel. It's really cool. I'm going to show you there's a bit of an issue with this one. We're going to zoom in. And whenever you have cut lines, you don't want to have lots of points. And there are a ton of points in these little tiny 1.5 millimeter circles. So I'm going to show you how to get rid of those. They're really problematic because the knife is going to hit every single point, and it's not going to look as good as when you have fewer points. So I'm going to show you how to do this with fewer points. You can actually fill it with black and retrace it, which will simplify. But I'm going to show you something else. I'm going to release the compound path so those dots are no longer part of their shapes. And then I'm going to do a drag box, and I'm just going to touch the bottom of the shapes. I'm not going to touch the dots. So I've got the rectangle selected and the bottom of the shapes. And then I'm going to weld, and I actually missed a couple. So I'm going to do another drag box and weld again. So now the circles are in the right place, but they weren't part of the compound path. And if I make them a compound path now, they're going to be nice and simple. And I'm going to zoom in and show you by double clicking. There's only 4 points. That's very nice. It'll cut beautifully. So that's what I recommend, is make sure that any kind of cutouts you have and any of your bezels are very simple point-wise. And I've given you 2 strategies to fix that if you have an issue. So I'm going to now use this little 77 millimeter. So what I'm going to do is I want this to meet up in the right place, even though I've got extra spires. So I have the ends are just about halfway between the spires, and I just need to adjust where the 77 millimeters hits, so it's about halfway too. This makes it more likely that your paper test is going to actually be perfect and you won't have to adjust. I'll show you how to adjust, but it's nice not to have to do that. So I'm going to move this back up where it belongs. And we are going to be ready to do our paper test. But first I'm going to do a little thing that I discovered when I was using paper type clays, which don't reconstitute beautifully like FS999. I'm going to put a little hat on top of it, and I'm going to use the polygon drawing tool. And I'm going to do this because it's going to give me a second bezel. And it just makes the whole thing more efficient. And if you don't like it, you can reconstitute it. I'm going to hit escape when I get to the end of the little hat. I'm just going to tuck it in. And I don't want a rectangle because I don't want to go over that bottom line twice. I don't want the bottom of the bezel to be messy. But this is going to give me a second bezel. I've got my first one, but right where the cursor's going, we're going to have a second bezel. And you'll see when we do the paper type that it can be a really, really helpful thing. And I pre-fire my bezels and I can use them anytime I want. I have a whole selection of them. So now I'm going to copy and we're going to go to a new tab where I'll show you what the settings are for the paper test. Okay, now we're ready to do our paper test. What we're going to do is we're going to cut this out of cardstock or watercolor paper that's about 0.25 millimeters thick. And we're going to cut it and we're going to put it around the stone and see if if it's going to meet up in the right place. Now our bezel is actually going to be 1.5 cards thick, so we'll want to give it a little wiggle room, and you'll see that when we actually test it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use cardstock, and I've used like inexpensive cardstock from Costco. Worked just fine as long as I have a sharp blade, and I use a separate blade for metal clay and paper. So I'm going to just put the piece of cardstock on, and we're going to go ahead and go to the Send tab because now we're ready to tell it what we want that blade to do. It's always going to default on simple. We don't ever want to choose simple. We always use line color. We color code everything, and simple is kind of a holdover from an older version. When you first get to the Send tab, you're going to see Tools, and there's two choices on Tools, the left-hand holder and the right-hand holder. I always put the blade in the left-hand holder. I'm going to uncheck blue because that's actually that title up there. And then I'm going to go across and we're going to go to the paper setting that we have set up. So we're going to go down to watercolor 0.25, which is 1 card thickness. And I'm going to put the blade at 6 or 7. So you actually have, this is for notation only, so you want to change that blade. Now we're going to do a paper test, which is testing the length of the bezel with paper. I'm going to put cardstock that is about 1 card thick, which is very regular stationery store cardstock. I've got 2 blades. One is for paper and one is for bezels. Paper tends to dull the blade, so we're always going to have a separate blade for paper and plastics. I'm going to change the length of this because this is 1 card thick and the length for this should be 8. So what I'm doing is I'm putting it in this hole at the end and I'm supporting it with my hand underneath so I don't put pressure on those wheels. And I'm just going to click it until the number is at 8. Then I'm going to put it back in and lock it into place. Now we need to push the platform in where the notch is past the first wheel and hit the load unload button. And it's going to adjust itself to the perfect place. I'm using a force of 20 and we're going to do 1 pass. We're going to go ahead and send to the Silhouette and we'll cut it and we'll be able to test that bezel. Okay, I'm going to unload. Let's make sure it cut all the way through. It did. And this is where I'm going to show you in the design file I talked about you having 2 bezels after you cut. This is the second bezel. This is a byproduct bezel that's going to work great on any project. And that's why I designed it that way, so you always have a second bezel. And here is the original bezel. Okay, now we're ready to test our paper bezel to get a really true width of the bezel. Again, you want to give a little looseness because this is a little bit thinner than the actual clay. And we're going to see where it meets up. And we're going to draw a line. And then we're actually going to take the ruler and test that measurement. So let's test it right now to see how close we are. So this is about 77, and I'm just going to check in the computer to make sure that the bezels will be cut in the right place at 77 millimeters. And assess whether we need an adjustment. I'm going to show you how to do that adjustment. If not, you could skip this part and go on to the next step. So I determined that I really wanted 78 millimeters, so I'm going to draw a straight line. And I'm going to change the measurement to 78. Then I'm going to take it up and put it here in the bezel. And you want to be sure it's going to meet right where the space is in the end. And I have been pretty careful to make sure this is about the same distance as halfway between these spires. It's important. And I'm going to see that I need to adjust this a little bit so this one ends up in the middle. And it's not a huge adjustment, but you want it to fit perfectly. So there we go. I've moved it a little bit. And now I can get rid of this. I'm going to actually make a copy of this, a duplicate. We're going to take it up here. And I'm going to put this under 100% design. So this is your fired size after shrinkage. So now I'm going to go and take this one and I'm going to increase it for shrinkage. And you can't forget this step because it's really important. It shrinks about 8% for 1.5 cards. So I'm going to go over to this scale window, this transform window. I'm going to hit the scale button and I'm going to choose 108%. And there we go. I'm going to duplicate it. And I'm going to put 108 over here. Very important to do that because occasionally you will get mixed up as to which is 100 and which is 108. And you can always go back to this left side and see what works. Okay, so now we've got 108. We're ready to go ahead and cut. So I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to go to a new tab, and I'm going to paste. And then I'm going to roll clay, or I'm going to use clay that I've already rolled. We're going to assume we've already rolled it. And I rolled a slightly larger piece of clay because I wanted to show you how to do a little test. So I'm going to say this is the size of our clay. Whenever I do a box that's the size of my clay, I'm going to change it to brown. We never do anything with a brown box except for make sure it's the right measurement for our clay. The other thing you need to assess is the thickness of the clay to make sure you haven't actually made it too thick. So I've got a bezel and I don't want it too close to the edges. I'm going to zoom us in a little bit. It's a little tricky to see that brown box, but you want to make sure you've got it right up in the corner because that's exactly where you're going to place that piece of clay. The other thing I wanted you to add was a teeny tiny circle. And I would put it maybe right here at the end, if you've got room. And I'm going to change the color of that to orange. And what I'm going to do to make sure this cuts all the way through, with most things you can actually wiggle it out, but you really want paper type, a paper type or FS999, which is just like a paper type. You really want it to cut all the way through. You don't want to have to use your scalpel to work out any of the parts. And you'll see when I actually take mine apart that it comes apart very easily. But this is a way you can test your blade and your pressure. So I'm going to do a little circle, and we're going to do that first, and then we're going to go back and cut the bezel. Okay, now that we've set this up, we're going to go ahead and go to the Send tab, and I'm going to show you how to set it up. First thing you notice is it defaults to simple. We don't ever want to use simple. We always want to use line color. And then you'll notice there's a bunch of colors here. Remember, the brown was only just to tell us how big our piece of clay needs to be. And that we have measured multiple times to make sure it's going to fit perfectly. And I'm going to uncheck red because I'm going to do this little test cut first. And we're going to uncheck blue because blue is just that title up there. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to red. And I'm going to change it to 1.5 FS999 bezel. And then I'm going to go to the orange one, and I'm going to do the same thing. Okay, so only orange is selected, and you'll notice, let's zoom in a little bit. You'll notice it's the only thing lit up. If I were to check the red, red would be lit up. So when you're doing this test, you want to make sure only the little shape that you're testing on is lit up. Okay, now we're going to put our actual piece of clay on the mat. We want the actual piece to be in the same place as it is on the computer screen, so it's going to be right at one down and one over. I'm going to put protective film on first because I don't want to get clay on my mat, and I want it to stick really, really nicely. Once I've got it well attached, I'm going to pull the paper off, and I'm going to make sure that the actual sticky did not come up with it. At this point, you want to make sure you're right in the corner. And I'm just going to burnish it down with my finger. Okay, now we're ready to take our prepared platform and put it into the Curio. We're going to push it in where the notch is past the first wheel, and then we're going to hit the load unload button. It's going to adjust to just the right place. We're going to take that paper blade out, and we're going to put the blade that we've reserved for bezels in with a B on it. And we're going to go again to the adjustment part, and we're going to turn it until it's in just the right place, and it won't go down until it's in the right place. And we're going to turn it to 6. And 6 is the blade depth that we need to cut the bezel at 1.5 cards. We're going to put it back in, and the fin needs to be forward. We're going to lock it into place. We're going to do a little test cut first to test to make sure it's cutting all the way through. So we're going to go ahead and send to the silhouette. When we send to the silhouette, we're going to pull up that edge and make sure it cut all the way through. Our preference is to cut all the way through and not cut through the protective film. A blade of 6 will usually do that, but sometimes you're going to want to go up to 6.5 or 7. So just keep that in mind. So if you need to adjust your blade, you would adjust it now. So I'm going to pick this up in the corner and make sure it cut all the way through, which it did. These bezels are very hard to remove if they don't cut all the way through. And you can always increase the blade if that test doesn't go well. We'll uncheck the orange and we'll check the red, and we'll go ahead and send to the silhouette, and you'll have a beautiful bezel, and I'll show you how to take it apart. And we are going to send to the silhouette, and we're going to cut the bezel. And the cutting goes very, very quickly. It's mesmerizing to watch. I'm going to pick this up and it cut all the way through beautifully, so I'm going to hit the load unload button. So we're going to put it on a nice flat surface, and then we're going to pick up the edges of the protective film up to the clay. And that probably was a bigger piece of protective film than I needed to use. And in this case, I'm actually going to cut sideways because it's a long, skinny bezel. So I'm going to put my blade in, my tissue blade, and I'm going to go very slowly. Okay, now we're going to take and put the platform out of the way and find a nice flat surface in order to pull this up. Sometimes, this one cut really nicely, sometimes the protective film will stick, and if it's sticking or it cut all the way through, I'll switch and start going from the other side. And I'm just holding it down as I pull, because this is very thin and I don't want to tear the clay. Although it is, FS999 is pretty strong in this greenware stage. I'm going to pull the two bezels out, and I'm going to just gently pull them apart. So there's my byproduct bezel, which I'm going to use on another piece. And then I'm going to take and I'm just going to poke through these little holes using either this or a little needle tool. Okay, these are ready for firing. I'm going to fire them both at 1600 for an hour and a half, and then we're going to torch fire the bezel closed. Okay, our bezel is fired, and what we're going to do is we're going to fit it to the stone. What I'm going to do is I'm going to gently and very slowly bend it around. I like my bezels to meet at the end. The place we need to be most careful is at the point. And I like each spire to be on either edge of the point. So that's an important design choice for this stone. I'm going to bend it over, and you can see it fits perfectly. This spire is right on top. So I'm going to take the pen and I'm going to mark where I want to snip. And then I'm going to snip a little bit to the right of that. I want to give myself a little bit of wiggle room. I've cut bezels in metalworking, and I've cut them too short, and then you have to start all over. So I'm just going to snip a little bit. Then we'll bend it around the stone again just to be safe. And I think I do need to do that extra little bit. But I'd rather do a second cut than have to redo it. At this point, just like with metalworking, you want to make your ends very, very flat and very, very straight. These Joyce Chen scissors will cut very straight. Some shears will and some won't. I want to make sure it's flat. And then I'm going to do one more check to make sure it's fine. And at this point, I'm actually going to bend the bezel so these edges are flat, because it's going to be much easier to put paste on there. And I want them to be touching, so I'm going to spring load them like you do with a bezel wire. And I'm going to add paste. And I like to use this little Princeton brush to do that. And I'm going to put a little water on my tile just to see if the Princeton, if this art clay paste needs to be, get a little water in it. So first thing I do is I'm going to pull back the spring and I'm going to put paste in between. Then I'm going to close it together. And then I'm going to put paste over the front and paste over the back. And I'm not too worried about being messy in the back because that's going to be covered with the stone. But you certainly want it to be well joined. I probably use a little bit more of this than I need to, but I'd rather have it stay. And it's a really, really nice product. I'm going to put it in the heating surface and dry it, and then we're going to torch fire it. Okay, I'm going to take it off the hot plate. I'm going to use my tweezers. Then I'm going to look at it to make sure it's well joined and well attached. If it isn't, you would be adding some more paste at this point. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to torch fire this for about 2 to 3 minutes. We're going to go with 3 minutes to be safe. You're looking for a pink glow. And I'm not the best torch fire, so I'm very, very careful because I do not want to burn this. And you're not actually firing the FS999, but you do need to get it hot to sinter that art clay paste that we put on. If you see it looking shiny or sparkly at any time, just pull back. And every torch is different, so depending on the size and strength of your torch, you want to kind of practice. Maybe practice with just a strip of FS999. You can see that pink glow. If it were dark, you'd see it glow a lot. And again, I'm trying to focus on that join. But 3 minutes is more than enough for this. And this torch is a little bit smaller than my torch at home, so I'm getting a little bit closer. I'm going to work on that back part a little bit. And it doesn't need to be perfectly sintered because it's going to go in the kiln. And any sintering that hasn't happened during the torch firing is going to happen in the kiln. And there we're just about at 3 minutes. So I'm going to turn my torch off. And we're going to go ahead and quench this in water. Okay, now that our bezel is fired, we're going to go ahead and clean up that seam. Just as if you had soldered it, you do the same thing. It's a little tougher to clean up than solder because solder you use very little and it flows up through the join. You also want to make sure it's flat on the bottom. I'm not worried about the inside, we won't see that. but I do want to make sure it looks nice right here. And you don't want to have to do this after it's attached. It's not easy to get at. And I usually use a hand file. I think if you put a Dremel tool on this, I'm a little afraid you'll Dremel off one of the spires. So that's pretty good. And it looks nice and flat, and that's going to be easy. So now we're going to take our stone back in, and we're going to form it back around the stone. Remember, we flattened it out to torch fire it and to add the paste. Actually, it wasn't for the torch firing, it was to add the paste. It made it a lot easier to join. And I'm just going to gently squeeze it, and it has a little bit of give, which we know with a stone, that's what you want when you're setting it. And I want to make sure that point has a spire on each side. So once I've got that done, I'm going to also gauge how high these little spires are. If they were too high, I could take sandpaper and sand down the bottom, which is exactly what I would do with a bezel. But I think these are going to be fine, so I'm going to leave it as is. And so now we have your prepared bottom, and this is completely fired. You want to fire this one at the maximum. 1600, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours, because we do not want any shrinkage to happen after this point. We want the shrinkage to have all happened. We're just going to join this with paste, but we don't want any shrinkage because everything's going to fit perfectly. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to get our paste again. And what I do, you want to center it as best you can. You can mark with pencil if that helps you. I pretty much do it by eye. You want to make sure there are not a lot of gaps. With soldering, you know there can't be any gaps. It has to be perfectly flat. And if there are a lot of gaps, you can actually take this to a dapping block and dap it flat. This clay will be fine doing that. I'm not seeing many gaps, and we can fill in a few with the paste. So it's really tricky to paste the whole thing at once. Pretty much impossible without moving it. So what I do is I take the paste and I tack it down in about 5 places. Then I put it on the heating surface and let that dry. Then I can freely add paste. I want it to be, this can be a little thicker at this point. It's going to be kind of like thick milk. I'm going to try not to move it. And it's not really flowing, so I'm going to just add a little bit of water to that. Because if it isn't flowing, you have to push it to get it onto the bezel, and you don't want to move the bezel at this point. On a bigger bezel, you probably want to do in maybe 6 or 7 places. Okay, and now we're going to put it on the heating surface, and as soon as that dries, it's going to be sticking in the right place, and we can fill in the rest and then do a little filling on the outside. Okay, so I'm going to take the piece off the drying surface, and you can see it's not going to move. So we really need to do that step in order to get I need to do that step in order to get the bezel attached. So at this point, I'm going to take a little bit more of my paste, and what I want is kind of a thick, milky pudding, thick pudding. So it was a little thick, so I'm just smoothing this out. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to fill all the way along. What you want to do is you want to fill in the joint. You don't want to add bulk. Now you can add a little bit of bulk, but if you added too much, your stone would no longer fit. So I'm going to go back at the end and smooth, but I'm just going to brush it along the inside so it's filling that gap. Our clay silver, there are lots of different pastes. This paste is particularly designed to add fire pieces to fire pieces, which is why I use it. It also fires at a much lower temperature. And because it fires at a lower temperature and a little quicker, that last bit of construction is easier. You're going to get your finished piece. But I think it's mostly because it joins the fired pieces to fire pieces well and easily. So I've got a little bit of a gap in the back, so I'm going to take a little extra paste and smush it in that gap. It would not be solderable, but with the paste will certainly do just fine. So I need to get it in the tip of this brush and just kind of fill in the gap. And we're going to dry it and take it back out. And what'll happen is, because I've added a little bit of water to the paste, you're going to see some places where I need to fill a little bit more. Just like doing any kind of join, you're going to continue to refine and refine until it's just the way you want. So don't just think that the first time you add this, it's going to be perfect. But I think I prefer this to soldering for my bezels. I think they're a little bit more secure. I've only soldered one or two since I started doing this process. So now I've got it pretty much all the way around. I'm going to smooth it where I see it being kind of bulky because I do not want any bulk. And then we're going to put it back in the heating surface. Okay, now that we've put paste all the way around, we're going to look at it and there's a bunch of places where it's dried where I need to fill in. I'm going to fill it in all those places. And then I'm going to look and see if there's any place where I want to fill it in on the outside. Once I do that, I'm going to dry it, and then I'm just going to smooth it with this little brush all the way around so it looks nice and neat. And especially on the outside, I'm going to feather it down a little bit and smooth it. And then we're going to fire it at 1472 for 45 minutes, and then set our stone. I hope you give it a try and enjoy using the Curio.
Visit our Learning Center at cooltools.us for more cool jewelry making videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and be sure to sign up for our email list to be the first to hear about new videos, new products, and other cool stuff from Cool Tools.